Welcome, everyone. My name is Gabby Samad, and we're about to start our program, so if everyone could take their seats. Please welcome Gabrielle Kurlander, our President and CEO of the All Stars Project.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to welcome you to today's President's Roundtable here at the National Headquarters of the All Stars Project, our Performing Arts and Development Center here on 42nd Street in New York City. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us around the country and around the world via live stream. Welcome to you. It's exciting to have you all here and to see so many old friends as well as some new friends. People are here, are community organizers, activists, board members for the All Stars, volunteers, young people, nonprofit leaders here in New York City. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I also want to give a special welcome to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Kathy Eden, whom we're going to be hearing from in a few minutes. Welcome. As the President and CEO of the All Stars Project, one of the things that I really enjoy is I get an opportunity to have conversations with people like Kathy, with policymakers, with intellectuals, with academics, with people who are creating new understandings of some of the most pressing issues that are facing us. And a few years ago, in 2015, I got to thinking, I shouldn't keep these conversations to myself. And so the President's Roundtable was born. And this is our sixth roundtable over the last 3 years that we've hosted in 3 all-star cities. And they are designed to create an environment to gain greater understanding of the debates surrounding these issues, to dialogue with some of the most innovative thinkers and doers in the country. And at our roundtables, we've heard from people like Dr. Carl Alexander, sociologist from Johns Hopkins, from Dr. David Chard, who's now the Dean of the School of Education and Human Development at Boston University, from Dr. Andy Wright, the Director of Evaluation of Southern Methodist University Center on Research and Evaluation. And last spring, I hosted Dr. David Grusky from the Center on Poverty and Inequality at Stanford, and Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who's now at Harvard. So we've had a very distinguished grouping of people to dialogue with, and I'm thrilled to have Kathy Eden joining us today for our conversation, in fact, a new conversation about poverty. We're going to begin today with a very short video. As some of you know, over our 36 years of creating the All Stars Project, and impacting on people in poor communities, we haven't done that by keeping people isolated, but rather by creating a broad community of diverse people who came together and have come from different walks of life and different backgrounds and whose lives connect. And at this time, when there's so much division in our country, people are saying, how can we come together with all our differences? A number of months ago, I decided to take my iPhone out, and I went and I talked to some people who I know and some people I didn't know, different kinds of people, and I said to them, what do we need to do to come together? How do you do that in your life? And they had some things to say, so let's take a look.
I think once you learn about people's experiences, then you have a broader idea of what's going on across all communities.
We're all trying to better ourselves, to learn something, to change things, to work towards something together, as opposed to people looking at this from a political point of view.
Everybody should be talking to everybody, because that's a part of being human.
Do you want to try to start that again?
One of the best ways to bring different kinds of people together is if you have everyone own up to their mistakes, because everyone makes them. It's human too.
All Stars program, man, it opened my eyes to that. I'm like, wow, I could get along with different types of people. I could be with businessmen and women, and I could meet strangers and just socialize.
It's like anything that you do at the All Stars, just helps you to meet different people. Asian, white people, like a lot of different people.
It was a new community that I surrounded myself with. It was really exciting to see like other students as well, not only like coming every week, but also like we're all in it together.
Well, I think all people who have made it, who came up by their bootstraps and are now vice presidents and presidents of some of the Fortune 500 companies, and they want to reach back and pull young people along. And I think All Stars gives them that opportunity.
The thing that I've always been moved by is that the All Star Project uses performing arts, if you will, to try and bring out the best in people.
When I got here at first, I was always a quiet person, but we played a game called Name and Gesture. It's like now every time I feel like I'm in an awkward position, I do name and gesture. So like that's like my performance. My performance is to embarrass myself so you can feel less embarrassed.
And what I am seeing is helping the young people that are involved with All Stars understand that they have the ability and the opportunity to optimize the gifts that they were given.
I'll go to an event and will be smiling for reasons that I just can't identify. I never exactly know what's going to happen, how I'm going to respond. So there is something there.
So it's really a magical experience to watch how one group comes together to help another group, and yet they get as much help out of it somewhat unexpectedly.
I live in housing, and it's mixed cultures. I speak English. I have Chinese. I have Jewish. I have Spanish. I have Muslims. Sometimes I have to say good morning to start it off.
And frankly, it's not necessarily just race, but it's, people of color from a different socioeconomic background. I mean, it's much more work to get started, and you just have to face that and not be afraid of it.
Bringing together people of different backgrounds is critical to sort of fostering a greater understanding of who we are as Americans.
I think that's a big part of community, is just not being afraid to have those difficult conversations about things that everybody is being affected by.
When I go up to a stranger, I tell them my name and they tell me their name, and we be friends.
So to introduce our special guest speaker today, I want to bring to the stage Dr. Lenore Filani, who will join me in introducing Kathy Eden and our topic, set some context for our topic today. Many of you know her. She's a developmental psychologist and grassroots educator who, along with Dr. Fred Newman, founded the All Stars Project in 1981. A longtime political independent, Dr. Filani made history in 1988 as the first woman and first African-American person to be on the presidential ballot in 50 states. She is the Dean of UX, our continuing school for development for people of all ages here at the All-Stars, and was a founder and is the director of Operation Conversation Cops and Kids, our award-winning police community relations program. And of course, we know her and we love her as a tireless champion of the poor. Please welcome Dr. Lenore Filani. So, Kathy Eden grew up in rural Minnesota. She says in the back of a van that her mother drove for the Swedish Lutheran Church, serving the needs of poor families. She attended North Park College in Chicago and then went on to earn her MA and PhD degrees from the Sociology Department of Northwestern University. She has taught at Northwestern, Rutgers, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Harvard Kennedy School. She is now a member of the Johns Hopkins University faculty, where she is the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor in the Department of Sociology at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Kathy has conducted research and published extensively on a wide range of topics related to poverty in America. Her recent books include Doing the Best I Can, Fathering in the Inner City, which she co-wrote with her husband, Tim Nelson, $2 a Day, Living on Nothing in America, which she wrote with Luke Schaefer and was the New York Times 2015 Notable Book of the Year, and with Stephanie DeLuca and Susan Clampett-Lundquist, Coming of Age in the Other America. If you haven't read her books, I'd urge that you do so.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Hi, everybody. So we met Kathy about 9 months ago when she first visited us here at the All-Stars. I was intrigued when she spoke about her commitment to helping America to see the lives of the poor in our country and to challenge through her work the many myths about poor people that have subjected them to inhuman mistreatment and ill-formed policies that have been a complete and utter failure. Along with Johns Hopkins professor Carl Alexander, who I also admire greatly for his work to expose the true intractability of poverty, Kathy is one of the few academics to get out of the ivory tower and to make an effort to become intimate with people in our communities, to not simply observe the poor, but also to learn from them. To her great credit, Kathy has ruffled the feathers of more traditional social scientists with her commitment to sitting down with people, asking, and more importantly, listening to them tell their stories. The All-Stars is not founded on, nor do we practice social science. Instead, we have pursued a different direction for both understanding, developing, and transforming people in our society. One way to characterize this is that we are committed to creativity and giving ourselves and the people in the poor community with whom we are partnering permission to break out of knowing and to create what they and we never thought was conceivable. This was one of the critical contributions that my mentor and All-Stars co-founder, Dr. Fred Newman, gave to me and all of us who have built the All-Stars over the last 37 years. I got a PhD in psychology, but I never saw myself leaving the community for academia. I pursued the degree because I thought that it might give me some useful tools to help curb the terrible pain and suffering that poverty caused to poor people, my family, myself, my neighbors in Chester, Pennsylvania, the impoverished community where I grew up. Neither traditional psychology nor so-called black psychology gave me those tools, but following and practicing Newman's radically humanistic, activistic, creativity-based postmodern psychology has done that. I attended a forum earlier this week that was sponsored by the New School. The panel was comprised of a combination of academics and city officials, NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority's general manager. The topic was Tale of Two Cities, Public Housing and Family Poverty in New York and Chicago. 18,000 people have already been displaced in Chicago, and the plan for New York City is to close the housing projects in which 650,000 people are currently living with no plan for where they're going to go. It's impossible to capture the level of distress that people in these situations are being forced to live with. In New York City, for the past 2 years, we've been working closely with housing residents and their supporters to resist this outrageous attack on the poor. What the panel at the New School chose to focus on in this discussion was the level of violence in the poor community. What is often excluded from these conversations is what produces the violence. What about poverty? What about not having enough food to eat? What about not being able to take care of your kids or living in a shelter or living on the streets? These discussions leave out also the historical context of America's relationship to various groups. For example, the enslavement of the black community and its ongoing exclusion from mainstream America, at least for the majority of it, and what is happening therefore to them. Violence is not genetic. So we at the All-Stars have fought strongly to have this history to be a part of the conversation. Otherwise, it distorts what is going on in the world. We are currently standing up to the New York City Housing Authority in opposition to what they are doing. The effort has received no support from the city's political class, but has produced a movement of caring New Yorkers, many of whom don't live in housing projects, but who are organizing in opposition to it. So I am deeply passionate, not only about helping the poor to develop, and I must say that the people in the housing developments have grown immensely and they're doing a phenomenal job, but also helping affluent people to touch the poor, to embrace the poor, to acknowledge the poor, and to recognize that they are part of our humanity and that we have to fight for and with them. I want people to have an understanding that poverty is devastating and just psychologically disorganizing, and that the answer to all of that we have discovered through our work has been to help people to grow, make statements, and fight together. Just as in Chicago and Baltimore, we have to be deeply, deeply concerned about what people are planning for what's happening in NYCHA. People have gone out on the streets. They've collected over 16,000 signatures. They're holding these little meetings in their housing developments where for the first time they're having conversations as a leader. They're speaking out as spokespersons. And when we went to the new school this week, we turned the meeting out. As I said, I've never saw myself leaving my community for academia. That being said, I have tried for the past 4 decades to be a bridge for others, humanistic researchers like Kathy, to come to All Stars and be with our young people and adults from East New York, from the South Bronx, and from Bed-Stuy, and with our donors from the Upper East Side. It's so meaningful that you and we are here, and it's very, very special to have Kathy's leadership and voice in the mix. Please welcome Kathy Eden.
This place is hard to shake, I have to say. I'm going to make a confession. I grew up the daughter of an artist. My mother not only worked as a parish worker in our congregation, but she was a fine artist. And literally, I had green or orange hair for weeks at a time because I would do somersaults into her oil paintings. I was an extremely active child, like a lot of the kids who come to this program. One thing the parents told us today is, my kid is so active, you know. I needed to absorb some of that energy. And I was that kid, but as a poverty researcher, I was completely blind to the role and importance of the arts in kids' lives. I will tell you that I really was missing this. And not only did I sort of miss it, I dismissed it. But quite by accident in the early 2000s, I got involved in a research project. And this research project followed young people. When we started following them, they were in grade school, whose parents had been part of one of the largest social experiments of our time. And what this experiment did is it identified children and families in the most distressed high-rise public housing in the country and offered them the opportunity to volunteer to move to a higher resource neighborhood. From those volunteers, they assigned some to get this sort of golden ticket, this special voucher that would allow them to move to a high poverty neighborhood with the government footing whatever part of the bill their income didn't allow them to pay, and some just left to their own devices. And so this experiment had happened in the late 1990s, and in 2002 in Baltimore, we began following the children that had been involved in this experiment, whose parents had moved. So I first went to Baltimore in 2002, 2003. What an amazing city. I was living in Chicago at the time. We were also interviewing families there. Chicago and Baltimore were 2 of the 5 cities in which this experiment was going on. But we continued to follow these young people in 2007. Then in 2010, over that summer, I was teaching at Harvard at the time at the Kennedy School. Our whole family moved to Baltimore so we could watch these young people transition to adulthood. And I was astonished by what I saw. And I'll tell you how the arts come into that situation in a moment. But the first thing that struck me before sort of the arts insight hit was that here were a group of young people that society had given up on. They were considered hopeless, unhelpable, and indeed they had hailed from, quite literally, at least in the Baltimore case, some of the highest poverty, most disadvantaged, most violent neighborhoods in our nation. If you've seen David Simon's series, The Wire, those were the buildings where these kids grew up. In fact, some of our young people had been extras on The Wire. And what we observed over time, so their parents had gotten this golden ticket in the late 1990s, and we were following them all the way through 2012, when we concluded the study, was an astonishing fact. Now, you might assume most of these kids got caught up in some way in the streets. But we found that what we found over the course of our study is that only a tiny number, 27 of the 150 kids we followed, had ever engaged in any kind of illegal behavior other than smoking pot. 82% of these kids were on track by studies, and they were aspirational. They had dreams. But they also exhibited an enormous intergenerational leap forward from where their parents had been. Now, this experiment got them to an average neighborhood. It didn't get them to a high-resource neighborhood. It didn't get them to the best schools. It got them to sort of the average that the city of Baltimore had to offer, which, frankly, is not that great. Nonetheless, only 7% of their parents had graduated from high school. For these kids, that figure was 72%. The city's average. 13% of their parents had at least attempted some sort of post-secondary education. For these kids, that rate was 51%. Again, about the city's average. 50% of their parents had been involved in illegal activity as young people themselves, and as I said, that figure was only 18% for these youth. Also, 60% of these kids reported parental substance use, that one of their parents was an addict while they were growing up. Almost no one in our sample was experiencing significant levels of substance abuse or addiction. This is what happens when you just give somebody the average. Now, we were able to follow up these kids and the other kids that participated in the experiment longer. We were able to use IRS data, thanks to the IRS. A team of economists actually conducted this work, who we were partnering with. And as they reached the middle of their 20s, and again, we're just giving kids the average. They reported 31% higher earnings, 32% increased college going, and the quality of the colleges that you were going to was higher. And they were 26% less likely to become single parents. Now, what the researchers concluded, this team of researchers that have been following these kids for the last 20 years, was that this was not due to sort of the usual suspects. It wasn't because their parents were closer to jobs or any of that. It was because as young people, they were exposed to a broader range of opportunities. They were exposed to communities that were more likely to have a recreation center, an arts program, a school that had more of these kinds of opportunities. What the researchers identified was responsible for these incredible gains for these kids was what they called a developmental effect. The developmental context had been transformed by simply moving from a very high poverty neighborhood to the city's average. Now, we wanted to go further, and we wanted to understand what separated the kids who remained on track, these 82%, versus the kids that did not. And we searched for all the usual suspects. Was it A? Was it B? Was it C? Was it the quality of the schools? Nothing worked. But then we began looking at the narratives of these kids, and we began paying attention, really deeply listening to what these kids had told us. One of the first stories that comes to mind is that of Vicky. We were interviewing Vicky, and it was obvious she didn't really want to answer our questions. She was sort of bored, kind of disengaged, as young adults can be. And in the middle of the interview, she suddenly perked up, and she said, "Do you want to go see my birds?" So of course we agreed, and she took us out into the backyard, and the backyard was full of pigeon coops. She and her father had built these coops, and she began sharing with us her dream of flying her pigeon in every park in Baltimore. You could see that these birds just lit Vicky up from the inside. And then she went on to describe how in the very troubled circumstances in which she lived, her birds were her sanctuary. They were this bridge for this very aspirational young woman from very tough circumstances, this bridge between where she was at present and where she wanted her dreams to take her. A second story, and I remember this meeting vividly, and actually I interviewed Bob both in 2002 and then again in 2010 and continued following him through the present. We're still in touch with Bob. He was the weird kid, was raised in the Somerset Homes, a housing project in Baltimore, and he was that weird kid who liked Shakespeare. And in fact, in elementary school, he took a bus to school. He used to read Shakespeare sonnets in the back seat. So, not exactly a conventional kid, and smart, really, really smart. So he gets into the top magnet high school in the city. But as soon as that happens, his parents break up. His stepfather and his mother get a divorce. His mother becomes a cocaine addict. The family falls apart. Both Bob and his brother are expelled from Poly High School, and they end up at the local high school. He's just crushed. But then he says one day he turned on the television, and it was as if he encountered magic. There was something so amazing, so fast-moving, so compelling. He couldn't turn the channel. What was that thing? Pokemon. But he also describes then, just a couple days later, he was at the mall, and he saw this African-American man walking through the mall, dressed in with heavy eye makeup, in black, with chains. And Bob is a very slight, at this time he was a very slight young person. And he thought, yeah, that's the way to stand up to the other kids, the drug dealers and so on, the threats in my neighborhood. I'm gonna begin to do that. And as he began to sort of dress this way and get very engaged in gaming and in anime, Baltimore has the nation's anime festival, he began finding other like-minded peers in his high school. Bob is still a gamer. He actually is a manager of a GameStop. And he and his fiancée travel the country competing in these competitions, these gaming competitions. And again, this incredible bridge helping Bob stay on track. So we really thought about, what do we call these things? These things that seem to be sustaining young people at this critical part in the life course. We came up with the phrase identity projects. Identity projects are things that provide meaning and identity, something to be about at a critical point in the life course. And they provide a bridge between where kids are at present in this aspirational future. Now, third, I want to comment a little bit on grit. So Angela Duckworth and James Heckman, a psychologist and an economist, have popularized this idea based on very interesting research. You've all heard of the marshmallow experiment. that grit is actually more predictive of success than cognitive ability. But the assumption in this research, never quite spelled out, is that grit is an individual level characteristic. That you either have it or you don't. It turns out middle-class people have it more than poor people. And the assumption is, well, if those poor people could only get more grit, they would get ahead. What we saw very powerfully with these kids is that when they got an identity project, like those young people out there have, right? When they found something to be about, a passion, whether it be anime, but Bob also loved white punk rock groups. And he thought this was being very conventional, because nobody else in his neighborhood did this. It's very interesting. So once they got this sense of a passion, something to be about, we saw astonishing grit. And we argue in Coming of Age in the Other America that grit can be inspired. Middle-class kids have opportunities to be inspired all of the time. There's inspiration all around them. In work I've done with Robert Putnam, we find that there's a growing gap by social class in civic engagement. And we argue that that's at least in part driven by the fact that middle-class communities have more and more opportunities for kids to engage, where the opposite is happening in working class and poor communities. Now, we don't want to be overly romantic about these kids. These kids still have an uphill battle. They have incredible trauma, and that theme came through in our book as well. We have kids who are deeply aspirational. They have big dreams, big vocational dreams, as well as artistic dreams. But Brittany once said to us, one of our young women, one of the first people I met in the study, the things that have happened to me, it's like crabs in a bucket pulling me down. Now, of course, she's a Marylander, right? These crabs in a bucket. One crab tries to crawl out of the bucket, and all of the other crabs bring her down. So just among our kids, these 150 kids, 25% had experienced the death of an immediate friend or family member, usually not from natural means. 35% had actually witnessed someone being shot, stabbed, severely beaten, or killed. And this is by the early 20s. 29% had been arrested and either jailed or put on probation. 15% had been a victim of rape or severe physical abuse. And 36% had to live away from a parent for a period of time, 6% in foster care, but 30% in relative care because there was something wrong at home. 9% admitted they had been in a fight where they had used a weapon. Now, when I met Brittany, I'll never forget her. She and her mom actually had a chastity dance because, Brittany was going to be the one that didn't have an early pregnancy. And they performed this for me in the middle of the kitchen. I actually have it on tape. It had cha-cha-cha in it at several points. But Brittany was sort of the hope of her family. When I met her, I was actually working in Harvard, and she didn't know that. And she told me as a ninth grader that her goal was to go to Harvard. When she took the BSAT tests in the ninth grade, she ended up in a performing arts school because of her grit and determination, her love of dance. She made up her own routine without any coaching and made it into this prestigious performing arts school. They made everyone take the PSAT in ninth grade. She scored high enough to become a National Achievement Award winner, which, of course, as you know, is a designation given by the Educational Testing Service for extraordinarily bright African American students. She had what it takes to actually succeed at a place like Harvard. But over time, we watched as that grit began to erode. She was sitting doing homework one day in her room, and she looked down, and she saw two friends of her brother standing there. They were waiting for her brother, but her brother had been called away to bring a niece to the hospital who'd gotten sick at a family picnic. So just by chance, her brother wasn't there. And a young man came up behind them, shot both of them. One died, and one was permanently injured. She was the only witness to this crime. A little bit later, she was sitting on her porch talking to her boyfriend, Damien, when a man walked by who'd been stabbed, was bleeding from several stab wounds. She ran to help him, but a paddy wagon passed by, and they took the man, not even an ambulance, but a paddy wagon, threw him in the back of the paddy wagon and took him to the hospital. Her brother was murdered. And we just watched as this bright young girl began to lose it. She began to miss school. She almost didn't graduate. She didn't go to Harvard. She went to the Army. But while she was in the Army, it was discovered that she was pregnant, and she was sent home. She's now a struggling single mom, but a med tech. She's still with Damien. They have 2 beautiful little girls, but she didn't achieve all that she wanted to, perhaps because of those crabs in a bucket. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about what happens institutionally to these kids' dreams. Now, most of our kids wanted to be nurses, architects, accountants, professors, actors. But over time, their transition to adulthood, much in contrast to the middle class, became expedited. Now, we know from the work of Jeffrey Arnett that the middle class, the transition to adulthood is elongated, right? Our kids are becoming adults very, very slowly, especially mine. I'm kidding. Caitlin and Marissa, I hope you're not watching. But for these kids, there's pressure to engage in the labor market. There's pressure to make your own way. Your home is overcrowded. They need your contributions. You're desperate to move out on your own. So oftentimes there was pressure to turn that dream of becoming an RN into becoming a nurse's assistant. That dream of becoming a pharmacist became a security guard, and so on. So these kids were on this expedited path to adulthood, and institutions were watching. The most common form of post-secondary education, so of those kids that graduated high school, 70% tried college, but 70% of them ended up in for-profit trade schools. And what we saw is that these schools, now there are good schools out there, okay? They're not in Baltimore. These schools, for the most part, got them into debt, trampled their dreams, and left them with worthless credentials or incomplete. So what we saw at the end was incredible exploitation on the part of the institutions that should have bolstered these kids' dreams, that should have taken those aspirations and shaped them. So I think in our advocacy, in our activism, we need to be that bridge, those people that provide young people with the inspiration, right, to get from where they are to what they dream of being. But we also need to be advocates in the institutional marketplaces that they find themselves in, and aware of the kinds of exploitation that they're at risk of. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm hoping that we can have a rich discussion together. Thank you.
I also want to ask Dr. Filani if you'd come up again to join us, and Dr. Bonnie Gilden, who I want to introduce, is our Vice President of After School Development, Research, and Policy. Dr. Gilden, welcome. So before we're going to open it up to all of you in just a moment, so be thinking about what you'd like to ask about. And before we do, I'd like to ask Lenora and Bonnie, I asked them to be discussants and just make some comment on something Kathy spoke about or something that made you think about. Dr. Filani? Oh, Bonnie, you can start.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. Thank you, Kathy, for your presentation. You captured so many of the things that I found interesting in that book, which I really encourage everyone to read. It's a very good read and lots of great things in it to be thinking about. I met Kathy for the first time this morning. I confessed to her that I've been one of her YouTube fans for quite a while now, and so she's got also some great things on YouTube. In my role at All Stars, one of the things I'm very focused on are activities that not only grow All Stars on the ground, but that more broadly help to establish a new field that we are calling after-school development. What we're looking to do is bring together research, theories, best practices, professional preparation and training that make up what we believe is the necessary complement, completion, or perhaps even alternative to schooling as it's traditionally organized, and also the engagement of poverty as it has been traditionally organized. And through conferences and working groups around the country, we've been able to involve more than 500 frontline leaders and practitioners from as many organizations, some of them very big, some of them at tiny grassroots organizations. But we're involving people in a process of creating some new kinds of conversations about after school. I was thinking that in some ways it's an identity project for people after school. And I see the work and some of the things that, many of the things that you discuss in the book that come out of the research as being tremendously valuable and supportive of that. The issue being that the work that's being done by so many people outside of school has its own distinctive and critical mission that's other than school. And in particular, that work reflects a rethinking and a new holistic understanding of the relationship between learning and development and the interrelationship of cognitive, emotional, cultural, and social aspects of life. So I think that's one of the most important conversations that we are engaging in at the grassroots and through this work. So I'm really looking forward to sharing your presentation today and the conversation we're having today, and bringing all of this into the important conversations that we're having all around the country.
Thank you. One of the things that I find profoundly disturbing is that Americans have been taught, and in particular poor Americans, not to talk about poverty. So people wander through the world having the experiences that you were sharing. They happen to them. They're completely destroyed, demoralized. They have no idea that what it has to do with is something that's much bigger than they are. And so I just think it's so important to grapple as, intelligent people and professors and so on and so forth with this kind of life that people have to live, as well as helping poor people do that. Otherwise, the kids have no sense, the parents have no sense, like they feel like I must have made this thing happen to me. They don't know what the world is actually like for them. So I think we should talk about poverty at the top of our lungs all over the place. And we have to teach people who are not poor what that experience is, and we have to support the people who are poor to grapple with what their lives are actually about. So that's the thing, these stories are horrendous, and they also are normal. So the issue is how to have people work on that, both the people who don't have to have these experiences and the people who are living them. Otherwise, I think just so much destruction happens. So I want to say thank you for that.
You want to?
I think that's right. We're a country that moralizes poverty. We think of it as a result of moral failing. And for 400 years, we've had that assumption. And so when we devise policies to address poverty, we do it in the meanest possible way. Because the assumption is that if we're not mean, right, all of these indolent people will get over on the government. I mean, this is really what we think. You know, when you go out and like I have the privilege of do, and actually spend time listening to people, of course, the first thing you learn is how much like you they are. People with hopes and dreams. And one thing that's very striking in almost every conversation is how strong the desire to contribute is. You know, I wrote this book with Luke Schaefer on people who literally are living on virtually no cash income, and that number has been growing dramatically in the United States because of the collapse of the welfare system and the economy. But even people who are living on virtually nothing will say things at the end of the interview like, well, you know, if my, we always ask, so what was it like to participate in this experience of being part of a research project? And almost to a person, you hear something like this: if my story can help even one person, then all of my suffering will be worth it. So the generativity is very, very striking. I have advanced, along with other colleagues, the idea that you have to be mean is actually an untested hypothesis. And what we're advancing is a counter hypothesis, that if you bring dignity to the poor, because after all, they're actually not them, they're us. If you bring dignity to the poor, you might actually see greater mobility from poverty than if you treat the poor with stigma and shame. So we're going around the country, hanging out at places like All Stars, which has a dignity effect, right? I mean, that's what you do here. You bring dignity and voice to people. And we want to see if we can prove empirically that the dignity effect is actually more powerful in spurring mobility from poverty than the shame effect.
Okay, with that, we're going to take questions from our audience. Please raise your hand. Yes, I see Gloria Strickland.
Now, this might be a question that could come at the end of this conversation, but I'm thinking about it now. So I'm thinking, you know, Kathy, I'm thinking that I'm happy that you and your work has met all stars in our work. I'm just happy about that, and I see that. You know, I read Coming of Age in the Other America, and I think about that you're a researcher, and I think we have just some wonderful, effective work in what we do. So as you've been talking to people and meeting people, from your head, do you get a glimmer of how your work and All Stars, or some new developing work and All Stars, could come together to continue to advance work in the area of poverty? That, yes, is not based on meanness. It is based on an approach about development, creative and changing people's lives. So it's just a glimmer question. I'm not expecting you to say I've studied this, but you've been talking to a lot of people. What are you thinking?
I think one of the things we're trying to find, so we can find examples of what we call mean relief. It's really easy to find that. And even some of our nonprofits slip into that, right? They slip into that same kind of thinking. So it's actually disturbingly common. But what's really hard is to find examples of the opposite. So when David Grusky told me about All Stars and Gabrielle approached me, she was probably shocked when I said, "I'll be right there." Because I thought this might be it. And so one of the things that we're doing some empirical work, but we're also beginning with All Stars, traveling in the country in search of examples, because in order to sort of sell this paradigm shift in how we think about poverty, we have to let people feel it and touch it and taste it, right? And this sort of identity project work is really resonant with people. You know, middle-class people are horribly shallow. We hold on to things that were meaningful for us. Right? It doesn't matter, okay, they're meaningful for the poor, but yes, I can relate to that because that happened to me. And we can all think of what that identity project was for us. Right? For me, it was theater, extemporaneous speech, and debate. The three most important things I did as a young person, and that did not involve school. So it's an idea that's resonant, and I think the example will be powerful. I've been working with the Gates Foundation Partnership for Mobility from Poverty, and we've identified All Stars as an exemplar in this, one of 4 exemplars in this arena. I hope to write about it more, so I'm hoping in some ways what we need to do is to knit together a variety of efforts in this same domain in ways that create a sort of a unified theme. You know, everyone knows what grit is now. I want everyone to know what the dignity effect is, you know, 10 years from now, or whatever it is we end up calling it. And so then we can say, oh, All Stars, that's about the dignity effect. We know that's important. We're going to invest in that. So that's my arrogant dream.
You know, you reminded me that one of our wonderful successes that we have is with our Hip Hop Talent Show program, is when people, volunteers or donors, come to it, or you know, white folks come to it, and then afterwards they're like, you know, it's too noisy, I don't like hip hop, but I support those kids doing it. That's a great program. You know, I'll applaud them. I'll support it. I'll give money to it. And you know, we have to teach people to support all kinds of things because other people, you know, are moving their lives on with those things, not even if it wasn't what you did, you know, when you were young. Carrie and then Alvader.
Thank you so much. I'm Carrie Loban. I'm a professor of education at Rutgers, so share that with you, and I'm on the board of the All Stars Project. And I really so appreciate this. I have a question, but first I just wanted to say that my students, you know, who are all preparing to be teachers and went into that because they care. What they learn in schools is the mean effect, and I just felt very moved by what you just said about how we need to counter that, because they go into it because they care and they learn that what they need to do is be mean. So I just really appreciate that. I wanted to see if I could dive a little deeper into the identity project concept. I completed a research project on the New Jersey All Stars several years ago, and what I found resonates to me with what you found. What the young people said was that becoming a part of the All Stars gave them a place that they could be creators, be a part of, that they owned it. I mean, it was very striking. Young people who've been there for 3 weeks used we in their language when they talked about it. And as somebody who's kind of grown up here as a researcher, what I saw in that and what the young people talked about was the value of seeing themselves as performers and players, and not just performers up on a stage, but that they could create new performances themselves ongoing. Very different in some ways than the word identity. So that's part of what I'm really curious about. And I was thinking about what you said about how middle-class kids have a long growing up period. And part of that, I think, is that they can try on many, 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 many different ways of being in the world, which poor young kids often don't have. And so I was wondering 2 things. One, in the discovery around the Identity Project, did you see evidence of young people kind of expanding their repertoire? Not just not being who they were before, but being that and who they were becoming. So that's one. And, I think I lost the other, so maybe I'll stop there, but wait. What role did being part of a community? Because the thing about identity is, to me, it draws to mind something about the individual being this kind of a person, But most of the projects, certainly at the All-Stars, what the young people say is it's being a part of a group that can lift them up. So I was wondering how that looked in your work and what you think about that.
Yeah, so one clarification. All of these kids' communities had been disrupted because they had moved. Now, for them, it was voluntary. What Dr. Filani is talking about is not going to be voluntary. But they had moved, so perhaps you would have seen more sort of community support than what we observed because there had been a disruption.
I was also thinking of like the anime.
No, I got it. Yeah, so we identified 3 different levels of an identity project that had different salience. So for Vicki, her love of pigeons was a refuge, right? And these were the least potent, the least effective kinds of identity projects. They were critical at sort of sustaining people, maybe especially emotionally in terms of mental health, but they were really an escape. So they didn't provide her with a community or institutional levers. A second level was really exemplified by Bob. What anime and goth and listening to Insane Clown Posse got him was a set of like-minded peers who were different from the other kids and who were high achievers. And so, they thought it was cool to study, but they had this incredible support system at school. It wasn't really about school, but it was directly connected to their engagement in school. But the most effective kind of identity project is actually an example I didn't give, so I'm so grateful you asked the question. And that would be exemplified by Cody. Now, if we had All-Stars in Baltimore, All-Stars would be my example, but in Baltimore, a lot of the more institutionalized opportunities for identity projects were revolved around the police. So the police explores, so that's just a piece of information. We probably need more diverse opportunities. But Cody just happened to go to a school that had both a junior ROTC and the police explorers. And I was looking for a metaphor for this, and my husband's like, it's like you're jumping on a train that's already moving. It already has an engineer, and you're heading in a direction. And so what these institutional identity projects do, right, is they bring you in contact not just with like-minded peers, but with adults, and often with adults with influence. And there are sort of automatic connections to the wider world. And these were the identity projects that were most effective for kids. And some of our kids, 70% of our high school graduates did go to college. A lot of them did not complete, or they ended up with a 2-year worthless degree. But for those kids who did persist in more conventional college careers, many of them had these more institutional identity projects. So I appreciate your distinction, and I also appreciate your critique of the word identity. So we academics have to have our intellectual discussion too. But yes, so you want to connect kids not just to their peers, but to a community that has levers.
My name is Alvader Fraser. I'm a human rights attorney and a political activist. And thank you for this forum. I think that...
Could you yell at me?
Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Okay. I thank you for the forum. I think you should probably have these more than once a year, Dr. Kurlander, and I appreciate that it is open to a broader grouping of people. So I think that sometimes the people in academia talk to each other and not to the people they're talking about, which brings me to your presentation on where you frame it as the middle class versus the poor, and you said nothing of the 1% or the capitalist class that truly is responsible for the poverty in this country. even young children who are not educated have learned the phrase income inequality because that is a part of social movements that have been going on in this country in our times. And Baltimore in particular, one of the poorest places in the country. And you know, people like to reference that TV show Wire, but it was about devastation and destruction. And when the Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore, they had all kinds of, because of social media and the internet, which is very beneficial for us now, because you have different kinds of journalists going into these places. And they had some young journalists out there doing the protest, and the kids, one of the journalists said, well, didn't you see this on social media? And there's like, he said, no, because we don't have cell phones. And he says, well, you know, what is a selfie? And this was like 2016. So you know, I'm kind of struggling with your saying that you have a new paradigm about poverty, because if that paradigm is still about just experimenting on the poor, going to the poor people's community and picking out a few people and tracking them, you know, what about the policy discussion that's taking place in Washington, D.C.? What about Betty DeVos, the new Director of Education, who has been, to this date, sued 72 times for dismantling programs that might benefit poverty-stricken children? So I'm going to stop. So I'm going to try to put my question succinctly. What is the fight? What is the level of engagement on a policy level, on a national level, in your new paradigm?
That was excellent. And yes, I mean, this is what you were really saying. We have to have we have to teach the history and the deep roots of poverty and the current causes over and over again, and we're all indicted. Every one of us is indicted in this story. I don't think I can, that's a big question, but I just want to tell you one story, going back to Baltimore again. And I think it's a small answer to a big question, but right after the uprising, we got a grant from the NEK, we called the NEKC Foundation. We said, we need to get out there and interview young people in the community because a story was being told about those young people, and young people were not being allowed to tell their own story. Our leaders were calling young people, including our mayor and our president, thugs. And we thought that young people should be able to tell their own stories. So we were able to, within days, I called a former graduate student who's now at Yale Law School, Monica Bell, just an amazing African-American legal scholar who actually studies how the poor, you know, are basically relations between the poor and the police, predating all of the things that we've been observing in the media. And she came to Baltimore, and we amassed a team of young people of color who were college students from around the country, and they went out into the communities, especially Penn North and Upton, those two communities right on either side of North Avenue, but also Latino and white communities. And we were able to talk to 70 young people in depth about their experiences and what they saw as the problem in Baltimore. And interestingly enough, their relationships with the police were not the biggest problem they saw. What they said, and by the way, this message was so devastating, I think we upset people at the foundation, although they did eventually allow us to publish the report, was we're not just abandoned and targeted by the police. We've been abandoned by the city. The city closed 100 of 140 recreation centers. There is nothing for us to do. No one is investing in us. And to a young person, they said, I see my future outside of Baltimore. Right, so city leaders, government agencies that fund city operations, decision makers that affect those agencies, wealthy people that fund political campaigns, everyone is indicted in that story. And every resident of Baltimore who's not actively working to advocate for programs like All Stars, for some, is indicted in that story. But imagine feeling like your city has abandoned you. So they were very articulate, and this was a very striking story. But I will think about what you said, and I take it to heart. Do you want to add?
No, that was perfect.
Yes, Micah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a Fulani Fellow here, so I'm learning a lot about Dr. Fulani's activism. And so my question is, it's kind of related to this, but it's about activism, and it's about whether or not activism can be one of the identity projects or way of giving dignity. This community has a very rich activist background. And so I guess I'm asking a specific question. Have you, in your studies, did any of those youth become activists? Have you seen the effects of activism for any of these things? I'm just interested if that's across your research.
You know, the answer is no. And that's terrible. You know, one of my department chairs who runs the Urban Health Initiative, Bob Blum at Hopkins, really believes that you can trace that to the collapse of the political machine. He tells the story, I'm not sure if it's true, but you know, he's been in Baltimore a long time. Back in the day, there was actually a real vehicle in the neighborhood to raise up indigenous leaders and get them into positions of influence. And he believes that is really atrophied. Churches used to give a lot of young people, churches, synagogues, mosques, used to give young people a chance to express themselves, organized after school time. And we see church attendance, religious service attendance way down, especially in this generation. The activists that we see in Baltimore right now are sort of self-made one-offs. Brilliant young people who somehow found Danielle Allen or Diane Bell McCoy, you know, a leader in the African American community, got some mentorship, perhaps, you know, and oftentimes these young people were known for their art, their masters at the spoken word or their muralists, but these are one-offs, and they're very articulate young people. But I'm with you, and I think that's an underdeveloped opportunity. And great that you're a Fulani Fellow. A+.
But we don't grade. Yes, Harry.
Hi, I'm Harry Kresge. I'm an attorney.
Yeah.
I'm Harry Kresge. I'm an attorney and a long-time All-Stars supporter, an activist, I guess. So I really admire your work, and I particularly admire that you're here and are willing to be engaged. I was wondering, when I heard about your research, and I don't mean to say this in a disparaging way, but in some ways it's obvious that if you treat people decently and encourage them, that they're going to do better. So I'm wondering what you have to say to the research community relative to the role of research, relative to what needs to be studied, what needs to be done with the studies, so that we don't have another Kerner report, you know, and things continue to get worse.
I don't think the problem is with academics. It's with policymakers and with Americans. Americans are not convinced that that's obvious. Right. They're convinced that the poor are out to get America, that the taxpayer is going to be exploited, and that the thems are going to take from the us's. So actually, it's not obvious at all to people that this is true. And the reason we need to prove it empirically, right, is because policymakers pay attention to two things. They pay attention, well, mostly they pay attention to nonsense, but when they are paying attention, they pay attention to numbers, but they also pay attention to stories. And I think this dignity effect, if we can demonstrate it, and I think we can empirically, and you know, a lot of things that we think would be easy to establish empirically actually aren't. When I taught at the Kennedy School, I used to teach the course in social policy, poverty and social policy, and the students joked that it was the nothing works course, because we have all these great ideas out there, and the mean effect is zero. So I think we need to build a movement around this idea. We need to label it, and we need to provide really good examples, you know, that you can feel and taste, and some very strong empirical work.
Given what appears to be almost universal failure of government efforts, whether it's federal, state, local, to address the problem, I mean, one is, are there any places that have gotten it right that can be used as examples? And two is, well, what is your view? I mean, should it be at the federal level? Should it be at the state level, local level combination? And, you know, and what's the right structure for this?
Yeah, so first of all, who's getting it right? So I was not thinking about this dignity thing, believe it or not, because, you know, it is, I agree, this should be obvious, but I was not thinking about this until, by accident, I'd been writing about welfare and the family and you know, that kind of thing. And in my work on welfare, I was always so struck by how welfare essentially stripped you of your citizenship for a few dollars. I mean, even if you can get on welfare now, which you probably can't, we only have 700,000 adults on the rolls nationwide. This system is dead, right? In the average state, the maximum you can get is $420 if you have no other source of income. So, you know, this incredible stigma and shame, to use T.H. Marshall's imagery, it was as if you had to cross the road that separated the decent people from the destitute, the socially marginalized, in order to get those dollars. It was like a degradation ceremony. So anyway, I'd been writing about welfare, and one day a friend called me and he said, I've got money from the Ford Foundation that I can't spend. If you can think of a good idea, I'll give it to you. This never happens. So I thought, you know, in 1994, we dramatically expanded the earned income tax credit, right? So if you're poor, you get a big bonus from the government at the end of the year, way more than you ever paid in. And I thought, we've had this program for 15 years and nobody studied what people do with the money. So I wrote him back and I said, here's my idea. I think we should follow people who get the EITC and see how they spend the money. So these are the working poor. You know, the average recipient, I think, makes $13,000. So pretty low income people. And so I got the money and sent students out with sandwich boards to H&R Blocks all across Boston and central Illinois. We had 2 sites. And we interviewed people right after they filed their taxes. And we did find out how they spent the money. But the more interesting thing is what they said when they left. And we were out there with our sandwich boards, $10 for 5 minutes of your time. We conducted an initial survey to enroll people, and then we followed them. So, you know, I'd been hanging out in welfare offices, and just so devastatingly depressing. But people were walking out of the H&R Block, having just gotten a big transfer from the government, saying things like, I've got people. They would even say things like, I'm proud to be a taxpayer. I have never felt that. I'm proud to be a taxpayer. And of course, they're not paying taxes. They're getting back far more than they're paying, but this idea that you're going to the place where every other taxpayer goes to collect what's rightfully yours. One woman said to me, literally holding her papers, "I'm a real American." And we heard this story again and again, and quite by accident, it turns out that the way this program is administered through the tax system is like a consecration of citizenship. When you walk through the doors of this place that charges you $200, right? Takes $200 of your money to give you, what's rightfully yours from the government. It's like you have a crown of citizenship. And the way you're treated, of course, is like a customer. So that was the original seed of this idea of dignity, that we could actually do things differently. Now, I will say, I see the dignity effect as operating on all levels. A lot of, Laura Taka and I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this a couple of years ago called "When Taxes Aren't a Drag," so you can get more of the gist of this idea. But when you start imposing what we call this dignity litmus test, I've been going around the country talking about this, it's amazing how many nonprofits come to me and say, "Oh my gosh, we've screwed up. We've done all of these things that strip people of inclusion and that other people, and we're going to try things differently." Just one small story, a soup kitchen in Trenton tried an experiment. Randomly selected people who came through the door, got a tape recorder, and they were told to go into another room and speak into the tape recorder about something they were proud of. And then they came back and went through the line, and at the end, everyone, both the people who'd spoken into the tape recorder and other people, took a short IQ test. And then in the back of the room, there were a number of brochures about job opportunities. And somebody was monitoring these brochures to see who picked them up. So this is Crystal Hall, a psychologist from the University of Washington who did this study. And they found not only did more people pick up the brochures, far more people, but the folks that had had this affirmation intervention scored much higher on their IQ tests, especially in the area of working memory. And psychologists tell me this is really critical for decision making, for the kinds of activities you might want to engage in if you wanted to get a job or engage in forward thinking and that sort of thing. So I do see it at all levels, and certainly starting with the nonprofits would be a good way to go. I mean, nonprofits are just a drop in the bucket compared to the need that we have. But certainly nonprofits can lead the way. But we're pressuring child support offices and TANF offices, and we've got all kinds of people interested in trying this out at least the state level. I'm not sure anything's going to happen at the federal level right now, but we're at least at the state level.
Can you say your question again? Because I think I heard two things.
Well, part of the question was, given the failure of what seems to be universal government efforts for 50 plus years, is there a role for government? Where should that be, and at what level of government? And sort of what's the right structure? Is there any role for government, or is it not-for-profits? And how do you if there's an example of something that's worked? I mean, to me, that's one of the big problems of people, whether it's at the federal government level or wherever, they say, we've been trying to fight this battle for 50 years. We spent, however many hundreds of billions of dollars. That hasn't worked, and so we're discouraged. And so they say, you know what? Why should we throw good money after bad? And if you can show examples of success, and people say, okay, at least here's an example of where you can put money to work and have it be successful.
First of all, the government hasn't been doing this for 100 years in terms of, people have been on welfare, which is generally not enough to live off of. This government knows how to send people to the moon. We know how to make major and drastic changes in the country and in the world. So if this country, in my opinion, was committed to doing something about the level of poverty in America, we could resolve it. I don't think that we've just poured money in and it went the wrong way. Okay, clap. I just think that's so important. It's a myth. I mean, I grew up in a family and everybody was on welfare. You get just enough to do whatever you want to do, so people decide if they want to buy food or if they want to get drunk. Makes perfect sense to me because it is so challenging being poor. So this notion that we have invested, we're investing. I mean, development is a form of investment. The work that people are doing to expose the contradictions is a form of investment. And I just really want to underscore the fact that if America stood up, if our leadership stood up for decades and said, we're going to change this, we're going to take this on, we would be far beyond where we are. But they just don't, they're not committed to it. They don't like poor people. They don't care about the poor. And they definitely discriminate against different groupings of the poor.
I'm not saying that's the reality. That is the perception, certainly that is.
Right, so you have to go tell people it's wrong.
No, I agree.
No, I mean, it is a perception and it's inferior.
One little addition on the EITC. This program has benefits from literally the cradle to college graduation. And the benefits are so large for children whose families receive this credit, it's almost unbelievable. So we actually do have a lot of evidence. I think we need to be much better at telling the story of what the government can do. And by the way, you know, just to be realistic, there is no way the nonprofit sector can shoulder this burden. It is too big. Changes in our economy are too significant. Even if people work full-time, full year, they're making half of a living wage unless they have a college graduation. So it's a degree. So it's just too big of a problem for the nonprofit sector. But they can be exemplars and they can be innovators because government is not typically an innovator.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and I think that actually one of the things goes on with the nonprofit sector is our organizations and institutions are judged by virtue of, oh, well, how are you creating social mobility? Well, you know, come on now. I mean, we don't have enough jobs in our country. I mean, let's go through the things that are wrong on a policy and political level that the nonprofit sector is not going to solve. And I think that going to your question, Peter, and the point that Dr. Fulani is making, I mean, if America is a country, and there are other countries done this too, but we've decided some things are unacceptable. We did, and you know, you could probably give a lot of descriptions of how does that happen in a country? How do you decide as a culture, as a society, some things won't go on any longer? Used to be slavery in this country. There is slavery no more in this country in that specific form that it was. That was a complex process, a lot of different kinds of things legalistically and all of that. But I guess we would argue that that's a profound cultural and social shift. And that's why I think that this is what the nonprofit sector, I think, can do, is play a huge role in creating a cultural and social shift relative to the dignity of the poor and relative to how people at the 1%, people in the middle, people at the bottom, everyone understands and sees who people are who are poor, what our country is doing, and how we can move forward in that together. And I think that that's that cultural shift, that developmental shift, if you will, is a more proper role for our sector, and to then create models, if you will, that then some really big people got to come in and say, okay, we're going to take this model and now we're going to make it the way we do this. We're going to have a cabinet for social development like we have an education department. We're going to have, these are the things that we need to invest in America. I want to take some more questions. Dr. Holzman?
Hi, thank you. At the very beginning of your talk, I realized I had this question, and every single comment has made the question really big for me. I hope I can articulate it clearly. So, I think the academics are part of the problem. I remember you said it's the policymakers. They are in bed with each other. it is so clear that most of them are in bed with each other. They get their grants, they get, I mean, in every single way. And those that aren't don't get hurt. So I hope you get hurt. Why don't they, and the way what Alveda and Micah were saying about activism and policy, it seems to me that, at least my own experience as a researcher who kind of transitioned when I started doing development work in this way with the All-Stars and other places and trying to create a new kind of research, is that I'm a community organizer who happens to be a researcher. And that's a completely different position from being a researcher who happens to be a community activist. So I think that there is, my experience is the impact in, for example, psychology research and in educational research, the impact of the kind of work you're doing that actually involves people, even more than just talking to them, treats them not as numbers and subjects. The impact is minimal, because what isn't addressed is something that you said several times, which I guess this is my real question. What are empirics? What are they? Who determined what empirics are? How come right now this isn't counted as empirical? That's what gets me really, really, really angry and frustrated. And that's what I work on, and I wonder what you think about that.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, first of all, I think we all have our role to play. So I remember we had a Arthur Meeks Critics session for $2 a day at Johns Hopkins. And I invited the two most different people I could think of to be critics. Michael Reich, who's at the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland. He might be your secret twin. And Bob Greenstein, who's the head of the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington. One is an idealist, the other is a pragmatist. And I see myself as being in the middle on that spectrum. But I respect Bob Greenstein enough to know that we need people, pragmatists, and I respect you enough to really hear what you're saying. Maybe we'll have minimal impact, and maybe we won't. You know, I have to say, I was really encouraged yesterday. We've been floating around we thought a pretty innovative proposal to try to end $2 a day poverty. It was an idea to radically expand this little program we have called the Child Tax Credit into something that could really support poor families with children. It would be universal, so it wouldn't be labeled as a poor person's program, and it would really honor parents for the sacrifice and expense of doing the social good of raising children. And when we wrote this proposal, we thought it was completely pie in the sky, but it was introduced by Sherrod Brown yesterday. So, Senator from Ohio, you just don't know. I mean, I think we have to keep trying. And sometimes our efforts will collide with history in ways that are miraculous, even magical. David Elwood, my former dean of the Kennedy School, was just a guy with a paper. He had a dream that we should support working families. He met Bill Clinton at the right time, and right now we're spending $70 billion that we were not spending before supporting low-income working families. And most of the poor, the vast majority of the poor, are workers. So I'm not a pessimist about what it is I do. I'm an optimist. And I think you never know. You have to keep trying. As to the point about academics being in bed, I'm not sure that's true. It may be partially true. It's part of my appointments at a school of public health, and wow, I admire those people because they are
literally at the grindstone day and night writing those grants. They have to support their own salaries. And I do think that treadmill reduces creativity and voice in ways that are not good for science. For those of us who are lucky enough to have identified private funders, it's a privilege to have that kind of funding available. But you know, we're all, I would just really encourage all of us to be hopeful. You know, we just don't know. So I refuse to be pessimistic.
One thing I want to say, I think that how things move forward are interesting. So to me, what's important about us meeting you, your being here, and we're here together, is that it's building relationships that may have nothing whatsoever to do with anybody's content in some ways, but that allow for us to continue to penetrate. This is what we're doing, we're penetrating these institutions. And no, it's very important. And I'm working on the Black educators. I'm about to jump off a roof, so I'm not going to say how well that's going. But I think I think the transformation of things come in a lot of different ways, including how people come together and what people come together, and the content could be all over the place, and sometimes it's not. But I just really wanted to share that because I think that's important. I think we have to infiltrate, and you're free to do likewise.
Yes, Rich?
Hi, I'm Rich Sockel. I chair the board of the All-Stars and also the director of research at a hedge fund called Davis & Kentner. So I'm an idealist and a pragmatist. I like to mix them up. This has been a great conversation. Actually, in some ways, I wanted to go back to something Carrie was raising, because I think it's not just an issue of academics. I don't think, as a non-academic, I think the question of community and community building is a critical question. And Gabrielle, I thought what you said was very important in terms of what role we can play in the nonprofit sector, and we've been addressing that, I think, here at the All-Stars. The role that we've been able to play is being innovators. And I think one of the things we've discovered, and is underappreciated, though I think you're getting at it, though I think we need to go further with it, is the importance of community building. Not just the community we physically are living in, but the communities that we create. So I think your story about the young man and discovering the goth community and finding and creating, being part of that community is underappreciated, because a lot of the studies, a lot of the focus is on individuals. And what's being missed is how do we do at building and creating community? And I think in some way that is underneath Peter's question, because in a way that's the bigger community of our society of America. How are we doing qualitatively at creating a better country? And I think we've discovered at the All-Stars, it's an amazing thing we've discovered, and we're struggling with how to, how do you present this in a way that you can see this in academics, with numbers, empirics, we're working with SMU on that, and it's very challenging because my experience of hearing the discussion about how you study these things, it's not very oriented around to really capture the value of what we've built here. And so we have brought together in this room, in this building, and other places around the country now, the ordinary kids who aren't the 10%ers, successful business people, ordinary middle-class people, ordinary working people, to come together and create something that's a tremendously rich environment for development. Whereas it turns out inner city young people do develop dramatically, and so do the adults and the business people, because that's, in my opinion, what it's going to take for our broader community to develop. But we struggle with how do you, we're doing a better job of presenting that, but it doesn't fit in these forms of typical academic research. But I can tell you, as somebody who's a pragmatist, who works for a fund where you have to make a return, there's something of value here in what we've created that's value to the country. And how do you present that, make that a part of academia? And we're struggling with that. I think we're doing a decent job with it, but that's the challenge. And so somewhere in there is that a question, or at least it's a comment?
So if I were trying to study the impact of something like All Stars, I would never have gone about it the way I'm telling you the story of the back door at which I came to recognize the importance of things like the All Stars. It was not what I set out to do. It hit me over the head, right? And that's kind of the wonder of it. So exactly, how do we think about capturing this? And I work with the Center for Urban Families in Baltimore, which is a wonderful organization that I think is similarly transformative to this one. And we're struggling to capture what you have to be careful of is not to reduce your metrics to something that misses the whole magic of what's going on.
Yeah, right.
So I don't think there's a model, really, or I don't know of one for how to do this. As a qualitative researcher, I'm sort of released from the obligation to do the randomized control trial or whatever it is, economists do. And my goal is to tell a rich, textured story about what's going on. And that does count as research. I just gave the social policy lecture for the National Academy of Sciences on Thursday. And I'm the second qualitative researcher at the who's been admitted to the National Academy of Sciences I believe in its history, certainly at present. So I think more and more storytellers and listeners are getting credited as scientists. So we'll keep pushing that agenda, but I really think a qualitative approach to understanding what the magic is at All Stars is what you would need to even think about maybe a more formal form of evaluation. So I'm with you. I agree.
I'm going to take just a couple more questions. Dr. Fields, and then in the back, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy, for being here. I've been reading your book, both of them. Particularly, I'm a medical doctor. I work in Harlem, and I'm on the board of the All Stars. And $2 a day, I've been reading. So I wanted to ask a question. I work also as a political activist and community organizer, and I think reading your book, I've been thinking about, and here today, the relationship between innovative research and programs and work like the All Stars is doing, and the gap with public policy and how that gets missed. So our political process, as we know, is very dysfunctional and partisan. And I think one of the examples that you talk about in the book is the work of David Ellwood and the book Poor Support. And his model, by my understanding, was much richer and involved really supporting poor people and helping them to develop, to grow. But what that got translated into in the Clinton administration was sort of a funding stream that really had nothing to do with qualitatively advancing the lives of people who are poor, and also didn't at all address the issue of the relationship between the poor and the wealthy and middle class, and looking at poverty as something of our society that we as a whole have to address, and involves all of us transforming the whole, all of those structures, which I think it does involve. So my question is that if you have thought about that and what what your comments are looking at that, because I thought that was a very important example in the book.
So this is, I think, an example of how naive academics can be, myself included. But when David Ellwood joined the Clinton administration, he had this idea. We don't need to just reform welfare, we need to replace it. And his idea was to turn it into a true springboard to work, but in the meantime, usher in a this truly revolutionary system of crediting the working poor called the EITC. So I think the EITC was his big win. The big loss was welfare reform, because if you he was one of the first people who said we should not just reform welfare, we should replace it. And what happened, of course, is we didn't just replace it, we got rid of it. And he would be the first to say now, wow, that was a mistake. So we do have to, we have to enter into the political process, I think, with real trepidation and probably a lot of good advice. But it is easy to get hijacked by policy. And a lot of academics who have worked in Washington have had harrowing experiences. So I'm not sure I'm capturing the essence of your question.
Well, I think what I'm raising is the need to be involved in all these different arenas, as you were saying, and Dr. Filani was saying, coming together as a partnership and being involved in a way that really addresses the fundamental need for transformation, not just, handouts or from a distance,
right?
Really being involved in much.
I think the study of poverty among academics has been become very technocratic, right? And one of the problems, maybe this addresses your question as well, is that oftentimes adversity is overdetermined, right? It's not that a young person is growing up in a violent neighborhood. It's that they're growing up in a violent neighborhood. There's mental illness in the family. Somebody's chronically ill. The school is under-resourced, right? And there's no recreation center in the community, and there's nothing for the young person to do. And the police are targeting young people of color, and on and on. And what the rise of economists have sort of taken over the study of poverty, and the coin of the realm there is the randomized control trial, where you change just one thing, and then, like the neighborhood, okay, and this is, how I joined in this effort, but I don't buy that approach. And then you say, what's wrong with poor people? They didn't all jump up and become millionaires, So, of course, that didn't happen because, you took away one source of adversity, but you left people with 7 other sources that all predict the same thing. And I do think, and I'm not the person to do this, that we need to rethink our methods to really take into account correlated adversity. A young person growing up in poverty today in a high poverty neighborhood is probably in the 4th generation of living in a high poverty neighborhood, or the 3rd generation. This is really different from how it's been in the past. And as we become more and more segregated as a society, especially economically, right, this correlated disadvantage grows. Our schools are more segregated than ever before. Our neighborhoods are more segregated than ever before. Opportunity is more segregated than ever before. So what we've got is this knot of correlated disadvantage, and we do not have the research methods to deal with that. So I know Bruce Western, just come to Columbia University, is beginning to really think about, really brilliant sociologist, how we might deal with correlated adversity in our methods. That's more of an inside baseball talk for academics, but you all are a pretty astute audience, and I'm sure you can get the logic of what this problem poses for social science.
This is a great conversation. Just to add a couple of things, I think the importance of breaking out even further and the kinds of things we're willing to look at and talk about is very important. So when Rich was talking about the community building and All Stars doing community building with the poorest kids and business people. So if you look at the education literature, that literature, and they talk about stakeholders, they never even conceive that there could be something other than parents, schools, et cetera. So it is such a narrow conception of who can do things together to make a difference. I think that's one of the ways that All Stars in our living practice has broken some things open. So that was one of the things that I was thinking about when Rich was talking about that. The other thing is thinking about the kinds of things. I would listen to your talk yesterday and reading the book, and in ways that you have put on the table these psychosocial factors. I probably don't like that phrase, but just saying it, you used it. But that opens the door to a new kind of investigation and other people contributing to that investigation of what that is. And I think the opening up of those conversations, opening up who's in them, is absolutely critically important. And so just wanted to add that in.
God. I think the issue of activism is very, very, very important. And it has intellectual components, it has reorganizing components, it has to do with changing the world in ways that are very critical. And I love the fact that we come out of activism. I love the fact that we are currently activists. And I think that change, whether we're talking about intellectual growth to make something happen that has to do with theory or whatever, or the communities and our cities growing, are very much connected to that. And that it's very important not to lose sight of it. I mentioned earlier about the fight in the housing developments, and I have no idea. People say, you know, it's going to cost $1 billion to do this, that, or the other. I don't even know what $1 billion is. I don't sit and think to myself, how are we going to get there? Because I don't know that that's where we have to land in order to transform what's happening in the country. I believe in Dr. King. I believe in the many fights that we've had as African Americans and others in this country to transform it. So I like working without a script. I think it's one of the most important things in people's development, and I see it in the community, and I've seen it in the work that we do. Everything doesn't have like intellectual, and I'm not talking to you. No, response. You have to go out and you have to build and you have to create, and I think you have to fight for what is morally right in terms of how I understand that. And I'm so thrilled that we're involved in this fight in the city. I hope that the mayor, who is totally compromised at this point, I don't even know what to hope because I don't know what's after him. It doesn't matter. Maybe he should get elected again. But it's so powerful, community organizing and taking on these situations from the vantage point of not knowing where you're going to learn, what all the tools are, and watching something evolve. It's one of the most powerful things that we've learned, that Dr. Newman has taught us, and that we've done. And I also just want to underscore the fight for NYCHA, so that's why.
Okay, we're taking the last question. Yes, Frank.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Eden. I haven't read your book, but I most certainly will after this. And I'm not certain that this is fitting for a final question, but so I'd like to know. So I grew up in several communities in and around Chicago. And so every single community I lived in was entirely black and brown and poor. And there was a level of solidarity in that. There was a level of community in that and safety. But gentrification is real. And so I have had conversations since moving to Brooklyn with a lot of the residents who have been there their entire lives, a lot of young people who have been growing up in these neighborhoods, Bed-Stuy and Brownsville, that are quickly changing. And they feel that they are treated with dignity by their neighbors, their new neighbors, a lot of the hipsters that are moving in. but they grow up, I'm very worried about the psychological effects of growing up in neighborhoods where you feel like things are being built that you have no stake in. You know, that you are maybe accepted. I mean, a lot of hipsters love black people, they love brown people, and they'll have conversations with you and they'll treat you with respect and dignity, but you are still economically excluded. And I worry about that. So I'm wondering, I think their stories are extremely important. I think a lot of well-meaning people just don't know the psychological effects of selling a $5 cup of coffee in a neighborhood where people can't, you know, pay for other things.
Andrea Elliott's story of Dasani. If you remember back a couple of years ago in the New York Times. So this is a family who suddenly got enveloped, a poor family who suddenly got enveloped in a community of not hipsters, but whatever the level beyond that is. You know, I want to issue an invitation to all of you. We've been working with academics, practitioners, and mayors around this issue of neighborhood transformation as part of an initiative I direct at Hopkins called the 21st Century Cities Initiative. And our goal is to build a model of inclusive redevelopment where we honor legacy residents but create true or maybe recreate true community. And in those scenarios, you've got to have a way to put the brakes on. Last year, the Atlanta mayor said he was going to figure it out on the west side of Atlanta. The Mercedes-Benz Stadium was not going to lead to gentrification. I was just there. It has led to gentrification. We've got to have a way to put the brakes on. We do know from research that these communities don't generally have a high degree of social integration. And in fact, there's often virtually no social intercourse between the advantaged and the disadvantaged in communities, for example, like the South End of Boston, which is on paper one of the most diverse communities in the country, but in practice, a very segregated micro-community. So what I'd like to do is invite you to come. I believe it's November 3rd. You can go on our website, you can sign up, it's free. And come and hear what we're going to hear from Paul Jargowski at Rutgers, and Pat Sharkey from NYU. They're talking about neighborhood transformation and violence, and a phenomenal group of mayors who are innovating in this space. And you know, there are trials and tribulations and glimmers of success. But I think what's great about our symposium is that we are one of the only groups which is actually bringing together academics and mayors, right? Lots of people focus on the federal level, but very few people focus on mayors. So I don't have all of the answers to what those breaks have to be. I think probably high quality, hard unit public housing is one solution. That's a hard political battle to win, but the mayors are innovating in ways that I haven't even thought of. So come, all of you. We have room, I think we have room for all of you. And if there isn't room, I'll make room.
Thank you.
Can I just say one sentence?
Sure.
I think that the only way we're going to have the level of integration that's connected to what it is that we're talking about in gentrification is that we have to train non-poor people how to love and appreciate who poor people in this country is. How you do that is interesting and challenging, but if you don't embrace who human beings are, and your tactic has been to live as far away from them as possible, how do you engage them unless they grow? That's like all of our donors.
Thank you. Before we close, I just want to make a special announcement. We have 2 plays running here at the Castillo Theater through November 19th here in New York City. Last night I just saw Freight, the 5 Incarnations of Abel Green by Howard Kraft, and the actor is amazing, and it's just a really stirring performance. Urge people to come to that. And we also have The Store, 1 block east of Jerome by Fred Newman. Depicts a young working class woman's coming of age in the Bronx and the sexual humiliation and abuse that she experiences. Very timely, also very hard-hitting production. So please, they both run here at Castillo through November 19th. Come see these shows, and let's close by giving a big thank you to our special guest, Kathy Eden.